Well, turn with me, if you would, to the Gospel of John again this evening. For several weeks, we have been walking our way through the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John. And what we find here, right here in almost the midpoint of the Gospel of John, we find this narrative, we find this story, we find this account in the ministry of Jesus, what Jesus has done that gives us a picture that's unlike any other. When you take a look at the Gospel of John, there are several big places that always jump out. We all are familiar with John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. We know that, right? And we're familiar with that. And we know that within the context of the story. Nicodemus is coming to Jesus in the night to talk to him and have this conversation. There are big events that take place in the Gospel of John, but the raising of Lazarus from the dead, John chapter 11, might be that particular one story in John's Gospel that all of us remember quickly. And we may not necessarily realize that it's John who tells the story, but it is. And John is particular in how he tells the story. The evangelist here gives more attention and more nuance and more detail and more substance involved here than nearly anything else in the Gospel of John. In fact, the Gospel of John contains 7 signs. You've heard that several times already in this study, and it bears repeating. There are 7 major signs in the Gospel of John that all point to the very same thing, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world to bring the salvation of God, to reveal the glory of God. And every one of the 7 signs point to that reality. That's what signs do. Remember, signs always point to a reality that is greater than themselves. When you see the sign out front that says Viewmont Baptist Church, you know the sign itself is not Viewmont Baptist Church, but it tells you, I have arrived at Viewmont Baptist Church, and I'm gathering with Viewmont Baptist Church. These signs carry this purpose of revealing the glory of God, that we may gaze upon the one whom God has sent, that we may look with intent and look with purpose and look with passion upon the one who is full of grace and truth. That word gaze, that verb that we looked at last week, is so important because to gaze at something is much more than just to look at it. To gaze upon something means I'm looking at this with intent, and what I see, what is in front of me, is going to leave a mark on me which I will never forget, which has changed me in one way or another. And so John, when he writes this gospel, he weaves in all these 7 signs that are revealing the glory of God, that when we gaze upon them, we see what God is doing. And the contents of John 11, the 7th sign in the Gospel of John, is such a big moment. For this is where the Word that has become flesh, this is where the flesh and bone dwelling presence of God steps into the depths of human existence, where Jesus is stepping into a cemetery. In John chapter 11, we have this statement of being, one of the big 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John, as Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. John chapter 11 comes right at the perfect moment. John has done all of this intentionally. I hope you remember back to our first study when I shared with you that late in his writing career, it is said that William Shakespeare wrote nothing by accident, that everything was written with intent. Every detail, every nuance, everything was with purpose and intent. John does the same thing. And John takes the first half of his gospel and devotes it to these 7 signs. And they all build up to this big sign in John chapter 11, where he gives more attention to any of the other 6 combined. And he's slowing things down as if to say, now I want you to really pay attention. Now we're really getting to where we're attempting to go. John chapter 11 is the next to the last moment in the first half of the Gospel of John. Most Johannine scholars, or scholars who study the Gospel of John, will agree that John is divided into 2 halves. The first half is chapters 1 through 12, and that portion, that first half, is known as the Book of Signs. It's almost as if John has put 2 volumes into one, and the Book of Signs details out all of these 7 signs and does so in a narrative format, telling the story of Jesus and revealing the glory of God. In the Book of Signs, we have these displays of God's glory through these signs. The signs are wondrous events in and of themselves, but they are more than wondrous events. They are signs that point to the reality of the glory of God, what God is doing. The 7 signs. Jesus turns water into wine at the wedding at Cana when the wine has run out, and it's an embarrassing moment for the bridal party. Then we learn about the healing of the official's son in John chapter 4, where the official comes to Jesus and says, my son is about to die, and Jesus says, well, he will be healed. The man takes Jesus at his word and departs. Now that's a powerful phrase, to take Jesus at his word. How many of us do that? Do you take him at his word? Then there is the third, the healing of the crippled man near the pool of Bethsaida. This man who's been longing to be healed for years and years and years. And Jesus says, take up your bed and walk. And then there's the feeding of the 5,000 that takes place. And then Jesus walks on water. And then there's the healing of a man who's born blind in chapter 9. And then we come to chapter 11, and it's the raising of Lazarus. And John is slowing time down more and more with each one of these signs, because we're soaking this in and seeing this is what God is doing. And so the 7th sign here, revealing the glory of God, we are gazing upon the one whom God has sent, and we are gazing upon the purposes of God, what God is doing. And there's a confession of faith from Martha, the sister of Lazarus. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who has come into the world. You are the Christ. Talk about revealing the glory of God. That's it. All of this then leads to the second half of the Gospel of John, which picks up afterward. The second half of the Gospel of John is known as the Book of Glory. It picks up with chapter 13 and moves all the way to the end. In the Book of Glory, the speed at which John tells the story of Jesus slows down even more, and he brings everything almost to a screeching halt. Chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16, it's one conversation that Jesus has with his disciples, known as the Farewell Discourse. It's centered around the Passover meal, as Jesus discusses what it means. I'm about to leave you. I'm going to send another. Do not be worked up. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've already overcome the world. I am the vine, you are the branches. Remain in me, I will remain in you. You will bear much fruit. All of that is in the Farewell Discourse, this final conversation Jesus has with his disciples. The second half of the Gospel of John is known as the Book of Glory. And this is where we really start to see what God is up to. John slows things down, and the emphasis on the second half of the Gospel of John is on the cross. He slows things down and drags this out to say, this is where we are headed. If you want to see the glory of God, you must come with me to the cross, is what he's saying. Because there is no revelation of the glory of God. There is no revealing of God's great saving power without the cross. Is there not? There must be the cross. It is central. The last words of Jesus in the Gospel of John before he dies are these: it is finished. John is the one who records that. It is finished. In other words, and that's by intent, in other words, Father, I have completed the task you sent me to complete. I have done what you asked of me. I have been faithful, and I know you will be faithful too. In that moment, John would say, is when the glory of God is revealed at its clearest. This is what God is up to. What the entire gospel has been pointing to is that moment when Jesus says, it is finished. The work is now complete. The glory of God is revealed not through some kind of great and glorious crown and trove of riches, but through the suffering love of the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's how we know the glory of God. Through the suffering love of God. I hope you'll remember from last week as we talked about the divine pathos and how God feels and God is moved. God is unchanging. God doesn't change at all. God is rock solid, but God's heart is still tender. And God is moved with compassion. And God hurts when we hurt. God gets angry, right? You read through the Old Testament. You ever read the book of Exodus? God gets pretty angry, does he not? Pretty angry. You ever read the words of the prophets? There's emotion involved there. God is emotional. But the truth of it is, God is still able to maintain God as holy and other than. The glory of God is revealed through the suffering love of God on display on the cross. It's so powerful that John slows everything down, puts it all into a low gear for us to see truly the depths of it all. Now, what I've said each and every week is if I had some kind of creative title to throw at this study, it would be the seventh inning stretch. I probably just should have titled this series the seventh inning stretch instead of just saying that would have been a good title, right? It probably just should have called it seventh inning stretch. And you know what that refers to. I've mentioned it every week. The seventh inning stretch is take me out to the ball game when we know the game is coming to an end and we all stand up and we stretch our legs and our arms and we get ready for the final innings, right? And we're ready to see what's going to happen. This is that seventh inning stretch where John is saying, stand up, stretch your legs, we're getting ready for the end. And now we're going to see who's going to win this thing. And we already know, right? Because we've read the end of the book, as it's said. We already know. So far, what we've covered, Lazarus, we find out, is sick. A dear friend of Jesus in the village of Bethany. When Jesus finds out Lazarus is sick, he stays where he is for 2 more days. He doesn't go anywhere. And Jesus tells his disciples, this is not going to end in death. It's not. They wait 2 more days, then they arrive in the village of Bethany, and they find out Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and he has been in the tomb for 4 days. The sisters of Lazarus lament before Jesus. They come to him and they say, if you would only have been here, then our brother would not have died. And remember what a lament is. A lament is when we complain and we add faith to it. We are complaining to God with the faith that God is the only one who can do anything about it. That is a lament. Complaint plus faith. They lament that Lazarus has died and how if Jesus had been there, he would not have died. And there are a lot of people who are there in the village of Bethany who've come to mourn with the family. They've come in from Jerusalem, only 2 miles away. And they're the ones who are saying, could he who opened the eyes of the blind man not kept his friend from dying? Who is this man? What's going on? I'll remind you that here in this chapter in the Gospel of John, it's the highlight of the ministry of Jesus as John tells it. In fact, to once again quote N.T. Wright, the story of the raising of Lazarus in John 11 is, of course, one of the most powerful narratives in the canonical portrayals of Jesus. Told with a constant eye on the deep human emotions embedded in the story, it is equally full of theological importance. What a beautiful way of saying John 11 really matters. It really matters. We've looked at the theological responses, we've looked at the emotional responses, and we remember that this is all about gazing upon the glory of God so as to never be the same. Tonight, we are going to slow down. We've covered large chunks of verses for previous weeks. Tonight, we're going to read verses 38 through the first part of 41. So we're going to slow the pace down just a little bit to get the nuance of what's happening. Follow along, John 11, 38 through the first part of verse 41. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Jesus steps up to the tomb of Lazarus. He'd wanted to see where Lazarus was buried. He said, "Show me where you have put him." And it's interesting because they say, "Well, come and see." And early on in the Gospel of John, disciples of Jesus ask Jesus, "Where are you going?" And he says, "Come and see." And now Jesus follows them to see where Lazarus has been placed. And he steps up to the tomb itself. Frederick Dale Bruner, a New Testament scholar, describes this moment when Jesus steps up to the tomb and says Jesus comes to this historic encounter with death's seeming crown, the gravesite. And when we think about it, the gravesite really does seem to be the crown that death loves to wear, right? Because it is final. Things are written in stone, aren't they, when you go to the gravesite? It is final, and it marks the end of the physical life. And Jesus is moved again. Now, this term, Jesus is deeply moved, it's used a little bit earlier. We saw that when Jesus is weeping with the sisters of Lazarus, and he is weeping with the people. But this time, Jesus is deeply moved. The first time that phrase is used is in verse 34, just a few verses earlier. And then it seems to be because Jesus is encountering this lack of faith among the people. And the word that's used there for deeply moved, Craig Keener, a New Testament commentator on John, says it is an unusually strong word that's used there for deeply moved. And it's often associated with a visible and audible expression of disdain, like a growl, a grunt, a deep sigh of frustration. You ever been frustrated? I asked you this last week. You ever been so frustrated that you just, you do that, right? Right? Come on. I know you do. Yes. We do that. That's what Jesus does. When he steps up and he is deeply moved, he is frustrated at the lack of belief. Don't you get it by now? Don't you get it? I did open the eyes of the blind man. I fed the 5,000. I've walked on water. You've seen all these. All you want is just sign after sign after sign. When are you going to believe? That's what Jesus is asking. But here, Once again, Jesus is deeply moved. It's the same verb, same word there. Deeply moved. What is that all about this time? St. John Chrysostom, who lived in the mid-4th century AD into the early part of the 5th century, was Bishop of Constantinople. And in one of his homilies on the text here in John chapter 11, Chrysostom talks about how this is included, and we have this description of Jesus being so moved, quote, that you might learn that he truly did assume our nature. He felt what we feel. The emphasis on that phrase, deeply moved, used twice, almost back to back, helps us to see Jesus is the Word made flesh, walking among us. But this time when Jesus steps up to the tomb and he is deeply moved, could it be because he is angry this time at death itself? He sees the tomb and he knows what death does. He then calls for the stone to be removed. Calling for the stone to be removed. He's met with opposition from Martha, the sister of Lazarus. Why? That's a bad idea, Jesus. You're not getting this one right. Don't do that. Why? Because it stinks in there. He's been there for 4 days, and it stinks terribly. They all knew the burial customs. Mary and Martha and Jesus knew the burial customs in first century Palestinian Judaism. They knew what the practice was to wrap the body with linen and spices and put the body into a tomb on a shelf in the cave and let it begin to decompose and check on it for 4 days. And after 4 days, you know that the spirit has gone because the color has faded from the face, and then the body will be decomposing, and then you collect the bones a year later. They all knew that practice. Jesus knew that it would stink. He was well aware of it. Checking on the body was just a part of their custom. Martha says, there's going to be a bad odor, Jesus. You roll that back, and you're going to wish you hadn't. And she says that based on her experience with death. Right? She knows it to be true. And plus, the stone was there for more than one reason. Not only did it keep the stench inside, but it would keep wild animals outside from going in and desecrating the body. For a while, Rana and I noticed that our dryer was not working properly. That we would take a load of clothes out of the washer and we would put them into the dryer and we would turn it on, that dryer, and it would tumble and tumble and tumble, and then it would buzz and we'd go check on it and the clothes were still wet. And we checked the heat setting and it's turned all the way up. It's supposed to be hotter than this. This isn't working. And so we tried and we tried and we tried, and we were having to dry our clothes sometimes 3 and 4 times. And then by that point, after they'd been in there and they'd been rolling around in this semi-warm, moist air, they began to stink. Right? You ever had clothes that soured in the dryer? It's not fun, is it? And so we would have to take these stinky clothes out of the dryer, put them back in the washing machine to rewash them. Well, then guess what we had to do after we rewashed them? They needed to go back in the dryer. See, it was a vicious cycle, really and truly. Not a gentle cycle, a vicious cycle. You get that pun in just a minute. But, so what we ended up doing is we started shopping around for new appliances. And we ended up talking to a salesman who could have sold us a brand new dryer. And we could have dropped some money in the store that day. But he said, when's the last time you cleaned out your ductwork for the vent and all that lint? And I said, I don't think I've ever done that. We clean out the lint trap with each load, like it says on the lint trap, clean before each load. We cleaned that out. He said, oh, no. I'm talking about pull that dryer away from the wall and disconnect the flexible hose from the ductwork, and you might be surprised what you find in there. I said, I'd be scared what I'd find in there, to be honest. So I went home that afternoon, went upstairs to where the washer and dryer are. I pulled that dryer out from the wall, got back in there, pulled the flexible hose off, and looked, and that ductwork was nearly clogged with lint. And I said, well, this ain't good. And not only are our clothes not drying, but we are in danger of starting a fire in the house. This is a bad, bad situation. When Jesus stands in the cemetery in Bethany and says, remove the stone, he is saying the entire created order stinks and it's not working properly. Death has taken over. And you can try and try and try to wash and wash and wash, but it's not working the way God has created it to work. It's not venting properly. And the stink and the stench of death is there, and we've got to unclog this. Roll away the stone. Roll it away. It's not pleasant, and it's hard work. But trust me, I can do it, Jesus says. Does Martha think that Lazarus is too far gone? Maybe so. That's why she says there's a bad odor. Is it beyond hope? Just a little bit earlier, when she comes running out to Jesus, she says, if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. So she comes with this complaint and faith, and now she's back to this, but wait a minute, he's been in there 4 days. What are you going to do now? What's your plan? All in the same day, she goes from complaint to faith to complaint. Does that sound like anybody you know? Does it sound like everybody in this room? We are all that way, are we not? And we know that Jesus is the only answer. Jesus is the only way to unclog this. Jesus is the only way to fix the stench of death that reeks upon our lives. Jesus is the only way to be clean. You and I are like this a lot. Lord, if you'd have been with me, this wouldn't have happened. If you'd have been with me, where were you? But Lord, I know that you are still God. I know that you can do this. And then the Lord oftentimes will tell us to do crazy things in those moments, right? Like roll away the stone. Roll that back and watch what's about to happen. And we can fire back to the Lord and say, but that's not a good idea. And here's why. Because it stinks. I thought that we needed to buy a new dryer. But the salesman told me to check that ductwork. And at first it seemed really crazy to me to do that. I'd never heard of it before, to be honest. But I pulled it out, and I was thinking to myself, I can trust this man because he's a professional, right? He knows what he's talking about. I wonder if Jesus said to Martha, or at least looked at her with this look in his eyes, don't you trust me, Martha? Don't you think I know what I'm talking about? When I tell you to roll away the stone, it may sound crazy, but roll away the stone. Can we trust Jesus? Can we trust what Jesus has to say? Can we trust what Jesus does? You better believe it. We can trust it. Does it seem crazy sometimes? You better believe it. It seems crazy. Think about it. All the signs in the Gospel of John include this crazy command of some kind. At the wedding at Cana, this beautiful celebration, polar opposite of where we find ourselves in Bethany, to be honest, Jesus tells the attendants to fill these ceremonial jars with water. That sounds like a crazy thing to do, but they do it. Jesus encounters the man whose son is very ill, and Jesus tells the man the boy will live. The man takes Jesus at his word and goes away. That sounds kind of crazy. Jesus encounters the man at the pool of Bethsaida and says, do you want to get well? Of course I want to get well, he says. I've been this way 38 years. Jesus says, then take up your bed and walk. What does the man do? He does the crazy. He takes up his bed and he walks. Then Jesus, a crowd is following him because of the signs. And there's a wonder, how are we going to feed all these people? And Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, brings a little boy to Jesus who has a couple of fish and a couple of loaves of bread and says, this is all we've got. And Jesus says, okay, have the people sit down. I'll take care of it. This is what we're going to do. That seems crazy, doesn't it? Then the disciples are in the boat. Same night, after feeding the 5,000, they're out in the boat and they're struggling out on the wind and the waves. A storm comes up and Jesus comes walking to them on the water and they are terrified. And then Jesus says, don't be afraid, it's me. And he gets in the boat with them, and John says, and they welcomed him into the boat. The man who was just walking on water in the middle of the night. That's a crazy thing to do, right? And then Jesus encounters the man who's born blind, spits on the ground, puts mud on his eyes, and says, wash your eyes at the pool of Siloam. And the man does. 6 previous signs all include a lot of crazy, don't they? They really do. But Jesus is saying, don't let anything stand in the way. The glory of God is going to be revealed, and God can move any stone, anything. God can take care of it. Is the arm of the Lord too short to save? He will ask his people in the Old Testament. In other words, let nothing stand in the way of leaning into me and trusting me. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm talking about. We trusted the fellow who did not sell us a dryer that day. I went home, started cleaning out the ductwork and pulling out a lot of lint. I talked to my neighbor next door. He had the right kit. You can buy these kits, by the way, that hook up to your drill and have brushes, and it kind of barrels through like a roto-rooter, and really a fascinating thing. Even an attachment for your shop vac. So hook your shop vac hose up to it, and as you're cleaning out the ductwork, the shop vac is sucking the lint all in, and you don't have dryer lint everywhere. Fascinating. Somebody's made millions of dollars on that thing. I'll tell you, I'm glad my neighbor had one. We've got a large shop vac. It's either a 16 or a 20-gallon shop vac. When I finished, that shop vac was half full of dryer lint. Half full. And what we found out is that it was the end of the vent that was stopped up. You see, it's some 30 feet off the ground up near the roof line, and there was some birds or squirrels that nested right there and stopped up the vent, and we had to clean it out. You and I were created to have intimacy with God, for nothing to stand in the way, to walk with God, to trust God, and sin and death as a result have blocked all that, stopped it up. And it needs to be cleaned out. And the only way for it to be cleaned out is for God to become a human being, for the Word to become flesh and live and die and be raised among us. But we must believe in Him. We must trust this is what God is doing. We must trust that God knows what He's talking about and that we can lean into this. I love how in verse 40, Jesus responds to Martha when she says, "You're crazy, Jesus." Look at verse 40. Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Do you trust me?" Martha, is what he's asking. What does that mean? Well, for one, it means that Jesus is revealing God's glory. And further, it connects back with the beginning of chapter 11, actually verse 4, where Jesus says, "This will not end in death, but this is so the glory of God will be revealed." Jesus is taking his own statement about the resurrection and the life to an even deeper level. And still even deeper, I think it's a foreshadow of his own death and resurrection that is to come. You see, there's a number of connections between the raising of Lazarus and the resurrection of Jesus, and there's some differences involved as well. For instance, standing here in Bethany, Jesus says, take away the stone, and the people do it. But after Jesus has died, early in the morning on the first day of the week, while it is still dark, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb. And she finds the stone has already been rolled away. No one else need do it, because the strong arm of the Lord that is never too short to save has rolled it back. God has done what only God can do. John doesn't mention the stench coming out of the tomb of Lazarus. There's no stench mentioned at the tomb of Jesus either. The tomb of Jesus is actually described as being in the middle of a garden. A lot of beautiful flowers, I'm sure, around it. Did I not tell you, Jesus says, that if you believe, you would gaze upon the glory of God? Jesus has a way of cleaning us out and removing the obstacles that are in our way, that have been collected over time, that are keeping us stuck. Jesus has a way of saying, roll away the stone. Roll it away. Flip with me over to John chapter 20 as we prepare to conclude tonight. I love the way John finishes chapter 20. The events of Easter Day and the week later. John 20, beginning in verse 24. Now Thomas, also called Didymus, the twin, was one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came and stood with them in the room. So the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. And he said to them, unless I see the marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them this time. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Then Jesus said to him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. It's a crazy thing, Thomas, I'm asking you to do. But stick your finger into my hand. Put your hand into my side. Let nothing stand in the way. Lean into me and believe. Believe I am who I say I am. Jesus, according to John, Jesus did all kinds of other crazy things. All other miraculous signs. But these are written that you may believe that he is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in his name, you have life, abundant life that doesn't stink with the stench of death, but radiates the aroma of life. As Paul tells the Corinthians, you are the aroma of Christ, the rich fragrance of life, a life that is filled to the brim with the bubbling over presence and power of God's resurrecting grace. Thanks be to God. These are written that you may believe in the one God has sent, and you will have life in the name of Jesus. Amen. Will you pray with me? Oh Lord, we are humbled to bow in your presence. And we thank you this night for drawing us together and pulling us here as we find ourselves on the dusty streets of Bethany, gazing upon your power and your glory. May we never be the same. and like Thomas fall before you, my Lord and my God. Leave your lasting imprint upon us, that as we go forth from this place, we go forth cleaned out, restored unto you, trusting you, taking you at your word. And now, as Christ hath taught us, we are bold to say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you, church. Go in peace.